Right now, Mars sits roughly 140 million miles from Earth. At its closest approach, a radio signal takes over 3 minutes to cross that gap. At its farthest, 22 minutes. That delay sounds manageable until you realize what it actually means. The first humans to land on Mars would not experience a long trip with a homecoming waiting at the end. They would experience something no human being has ever faced: a separation from Earth, so total that the word home would slowly lose its meaning. The distance is not just physical. It is emotional, psychological, and civilizational. It seeps into every conversation, every relationship, every quiet moment of looking up at an alien sky. And once you understand what that crossing truly costs, you will never think about Mars the same way again. If you find these kinds of deep explorations fascinating, do me a small favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel grow so we can keep making content like this. Now, let's begin. Every generation has a destination that feels inevitable. For ours, that destination is Mars. You can feel it in the language scientists use, in the speeches politicians give, in the way documentaries frame the red planet as humanity's second chapter. Mars is not pitched as a question anymore. It is pitched as a timeline. When will we go? Not if. The word when carries an extraordinary amount of psychological weight because it assumes the hardest part is already solved. It assumes the destination is reachable, and the journey is survivable, and the return is part of the plan. It assumes that going to Mars is essentially the same kind of project as going to the Moon, only longer and harder and more expensive. And that assumption, which almost everyone accepts without questioning it, is the most dangerous illusion in modern space exploration. To understand why Mars feels so inevitable, you have to understand what Mars represents in the human imagination. It is the closest planet that even vaguely resembles Earth. It has a surface you can photograph. It has seasons. It has polar ice caps. It has a 24-hour and 37-minute day, so close to Earth's that you barely need to adjust your sleep cycle. It has canyons and mountains and dried river channels that whisper of ancient water. When you look at images sent back by Curiosity or Perseverance, you see a landscape that feels alien but not incomprehensible. Red desert, rocky ground, a horizon you can walk toward. Mars does not look like the crushing pressure cooker of Venus or the radiation-blasted ice of Europa. It looks like a place, a harsh, dry, freezing place, but still a place where you can imagine boots hitting the ground and a flag being planted and a camera capturing the moment for billions of people watching from home. That visual familiarity is extraordinarily powerful. It makes Mars feel close, not in miles, in concept. When you see a rover trundling across Martian soil, your brain processes the scene using the same mental framework it uses for the Sahara Desert or the dry valleys of Antarctica. Somewhere remote, somewhere difficult, but somewhere fundamentally within reach. This is the seduction. Mars looks achievable precisely because it looks like a harder version of places humans have already conquered. And because it looks achievable, we skip past the parts of the journey that do not fit the narrative of triumph. The cultural momentum behind a crewed Mars mission has been building for decades. In the 1950s, Wernher von Braun published detailed engineering proposals for sending humans to Mars. By the 1960s, NASA was already studying Mars mission architectures, even while Apollo was still flying to the Moon. Every decade since has produced new plans, new proposals, new target dates. The pattern is remarkably consistent. A new administration arrives, a new speech is given, Mars is declared the next great destination, a timeline is announced, the timeline slips. The cycle begins again. But something changed in the last 15 years. The conversation shifted from government-led exploration to a broader cultural expectation that Mars is not just possible but imminent. SpaceX began developing Starship, a vehicle explicitly designed for Mars transit, with the stated goal of making humanity multiplanetary. NASA's Artemis program, which aims to return astronauts to the lunar surface, has been framed from the beginning as a stepping stone toward Mars. The agency's own documentation describes the Moon to Mars strategy as a progressive pathway, with each lunar mission building the technology, experience, and infrastructure needed for an eventual crewed Mars landing. As of early 2026, SpaceX has announced a delay in its Mars ambitions of approximately 5 to 7 years to focus on lunar missions, but the long-term Mars objective has not been abandoned. NASA continues to study crewed Mars mission architectures, targeting the late 2030s or early 2040s, though no fully funded mission plan with a firm launch date exists. The point is not that these plans are fictional, they are not. Real engineers are solving real problems. Entry, descent, and landing technologies for Mars are being tested. Life support systems capable of operating for years instead of weeks are being developed. Radiation shielding concepts are being studied. In situ resource utilization, the ability to produce fuel and oxygen from Martian resources, is being demonstrated robotically on the surface right now. The Perseverance rover carries an instrument called MOXIE that has successfully extracted oxygen from the carbon dioxide atmosphere of Mars. These are genuine steps toward a crewed mission, but genuine steps toward a destination and actually arriving at that destination are not the same thing. And more importantly, arriving at Mars and maintaining a meaningful connection to Earth after you arrive are not the same thing either. This distinction is where the familiar narrative of Mars exploration begins to fracture. Consider how the story is usually told. We went to the Moon. That was hard. Mars is farther and harder, but it is the same basic idea. Send a crew, land them, let them explore, bring them home. The Apollo template gets scaled up, stretched out, made more complex, but the emotional shape of the mission stays the same. Heroes leave, heroes arrive, heroes return, crowds cheer. History is made. This framing is comforting because it places Mars within a continuum of human achievement that we already understand. Magellan circumnavigated the globe. Armstrong walked on the Moon. Someday, someone will walk on Mars. The distances get longer, the technology gets better, the story stays familiar, but this continuum hides a rupture that the Apollo comparison cannot survive. The Moon is approximately 239,000 miles from Earth. A radio signal covers that distance in about 1.25 seconds. When Neil Armstrong reported that the Eagle had landed, mission controllers in Houston heard his voice 1.25 seconds later. When a problem arose during Apollo 13, the crew and ground controllers could talk in near real time. The delay was barely perceptible. Houston was always there. Every heartbeat of every Apollo mission was monitored, supported, guided, and backed up by hundreds of engineers sitting in a room less than 2 seconds of light speed away. Mars is not 2 seconds away. At its closest approach to Earth, Mars is roughly 34 million miles distant. A radio signal takes just over 3 minutes to cross that gap one way. At its farthest, when Earth and Mars sit on opposite sides of the Sun, the distance swells to approximately 250 million miles. A one-way signal takes roughly 22 minutes. A round-trip conversation, the simplest possible exchange of question and answer, takes 44 minutes. Those numbers sound manageable at first. 3 minutes, 22 minutes. People wait longer than that for coffee. But now, put yourself inside a spacecraft where something has gone wrong. An oxygen system has failed. A pressure seal is leaking. A crew member is injured. You send a distress message to Earth. Then you wait. 3 minutes if you are lucky, 22 minutes if you are not. Then Mission Control receives your message, assesses the situation, formulates a response, and sends it back. Another 3 to 22 minutes. By the time you hear their voice, between 6 and 44 minutes have passed. If the emergency is the kind that kills you in 5 minutes, no one on Earth will even know you are in trouble before you are already dead. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. This is the physics of light-speed communication across interplanetary distances. and it changes everything about what a Mars mission actually is. During Apollo, the crew and ground operated as a single integrated system. The astronauts were the hands and eyes. Houston was the brain. Every major decision, every course correction, every system reconfiguration was a collaborative act between the crew in space and the experts on the ground. This model worked because the communication delay was negligible. The crew was never truly alone. Even at the farthest point of a lunar mission, the round-trip signal time was under 3 seconds. That is fast enough for a conversation, fast enough for real-time troubleshooting, fast enough for Houston to say, "Abort," and for the crew to hear it before the situation becomes unrecoverable. To understand exactly how much the delay changes, consider a specific historical moment. On April 13th, 1970, at approximately 55 hours and 54 minutes into the Apollo 13 mission, an oxygen tank in the service module exploded. The crew heard a bang. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. Command Module pilot Jack Swigert saw warning lights cascade across the instrument panel. He keyed the microphone and said, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." 1.25 seconds later, Mission Controller Jack Lausmer heard those words. He asked the crew to repeat. Lovell confirmed the report. 13 minutes later, Lovell looked out the left-hand window and saw oxygen gas venting into the void. Within seconds, the entire mission control room was working the problem. Telemetry data from the spacecraft streamed into consoles in real time. Flight controllers could see the same numbers the crew was seeing: oxygen pressure dropping, fuel cell voltage falling, electrical bus voltage fluctuating. Within minutes, Flight Director Gene Kranz had reorganized his team into a crisis response structure. Engineers who had designed the spacecraft systems were called in. Simulation teams began running scenarios. The crew and the ground operated as one integrated organism, separated by less than 2 seconds of light speed delay. The critical decisions came fast. Power down the command module to conserve its re-entry battery. Transfer to the lunar module as a lifeboat. Calculate a new trajectory to swing around the moon and return to Earth. Each of these decisions required real-time collaboration. The crew read instrument values aloud. Houston confirmed them. The crew executed procedures step by step, while controllers monitored every parameter. When the crew made an error or missed a step, Houston caught it immediately and corrected them. When Houston needed information that only the crew could provide, a visual check of a valve position, a description of what a particular sound was, the answer came back in under 3 seconds. This real-time loop saved 3 lives, not because the crew was incapable. Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes were extraordinarily competent astronauts. But in a crisis involving multiple cascading system failures across a vehicle with thousands of components, no crew of 3 can simultaneously diagnose the root cause, assess all downstream effects, calculate new trajectories, write new procedures, and execute those procedures while also managing their own fear and exhaustion. The ground team provided the cognitive surplus that the crew needed to survive. Houston was not just helpful, Houston was necessary. Without the real-time link, Apollo 13 would almost certainly have ended in the deaths of all 3 crew members. Now replay that same scenario on Mars. An explosion occurs in a critical system aboard the Mars habitat or transit vehicle. The crew hears the bang. Warning lights activate. The commander keys the microphone and reports the emergency. The signal leaves the spacecraft traveling at the speed of light. For the next 4 minutes, if Mars is at its closest approach to Earth, or the next 22 minutes, if it is near its farthest, that signal is in transit. During those minutes, the crew is alone with the emergency. They must begin diagnosing the problem immediately because they cannot afford to wait. Oxygen may be venting. Power may be failing. Pressure may be dropping. Every minute of inaction is a minute closer to a situation that cannot be recovered. The crew begins working through their emergency procedures. They make decisions based on what they can see and what they know. They may make the right decisions. They may also make decisions that a ground-based engineer with access to system schematics and decades of experience with that specific hardware, would immediately recognize as suboptimal or dangerous. But that engineer is not available. That engineer will not hear about the emergency for another 4 to 22 minutes. And even after they hear about it, their response will take another 4 to 22 minutes to reach the crew. By the time Houston receives the distress call, the emergency has been underway for at least 8 minutes in the best case, and 44 minutes in the worst case. The situation that existed when the crew sent their message may no longer be the current situation. The crew may have already resolved it, made it worse, or encountered secondary failures that were not mentioned in the original report because they had not yet occurred. Houston's response, carefully formulated based on information that is now 8 to 44 minutes old, arrives at the spacecraft and may no longer be relevant. The crew must then decide whether to follow the ground's advice, which was based on outdated information, or continue with whatever course of action they have already committed to. This is not a solvable problem. It is not a gap that better communication protocols or smarter mission software can bridge. It is the fundamental physics of the situation. Light travels at a fixed speed. Mars is far away. The delay exists and cannot be reduced. Every emergency on Mars unfolds in a pocket of time that Earth cannot reach until the emergency is already in its middle or late stages. The crew is alone not because no one cares, but because caring is not instantaneous across interplanetary distances. Now consider what a non-emergency day looks like under these conditions. Because the delay does not only matter during crises, it reshapes the texture of every ordinary hour. A crew member wakes up on Mars at approximately 6 in the morning local time. They check the overnight telemetry logs for any anomalies in life support systems. They eat breakfast. They review the day's schedule, which was planned collaboratively with Mission Control but finalized hours ago based on a message that was composed on Earth the previous afternoon. The crew member notices that the schedule includes a maintenance task that no longer makes sense because a different system developed a minor issue overnight. They compose a message to Houston explaining the change, attach relevant data, and send it. The message travels for 14 minutes, which is the current one-way delay at this point in the mission. 14 minutes later, a flight controller at Johnson Space Center receives the message. It is the middle of the night in Houston. The overnight team reads the message, consults with the relevant system engineer, and composes a response approving the schedule change with a few additional recommendations. They send it back. 14 minutes later, the crew member receives the response. 28 minutes have passed since they sent their original message. Nearly half an hour to get approval for a routine schedule adjustment that on the International Space Station would be resolved in a 30-second radio exchange. Now multiply this by every decision, every question, every request for clarification, every report, every medical check-in, every psychological support session, every technical consultation that occurs during a mission lasting roughly 1,000 days. The delay does not prevent communication. It transforms it into something laborious, frustrating, and fundamentally out of sync with how human beings naturally exchange information. The crew cannot ask a quick question. Every question requires composing a message, waiting for it to travel, waiting for the recipient to process and respond, and waiting for the response to travel back. Quick questions become half-hour exchanges. Complex discussions stretch across hours or days. The rhythm of collaboration that makes mission control effective on ISS missions dissolves into a staccato pattern of time-shifted monologues. The emotional toll of this daily rhythm is distinct from the acute stress of emergency. Isolation. It is the toll of chronic inefficiency, of knowing that every interaction with Earth requires patience measured in minutes rather than seconds. Of composing messages carefully because you know you cannot clarify in real time if you are misunderstood. Of reading responses and realizing they address a situation that has already changed. Of feeling, day after day, that the people on Earth are always slightly behind you, always responding to the version of your reality that existed 15 or 20 minutes ago, never quite synchronized with the present moment you are living in. This chronic desynchronization would gradually erode the crew's sense of partnership with their ground support team. Not because the ground team is negligent or uncaring, but because the delay makes them structurally incapable of being true partners in the moment-to-moment reality of the mission. The ground team becomes a resource that the crew consults when time permits, rather than a partner that shares the operational present. The crew would increasingly make decisions independently, not out of arrogance, but out of practical necessity. Waiting 28 minutes for approval of a routine change is manageable once. Doing it dozens of times per day, every day, for years, is unsustainable. The crew would learn to act first and inform Earth afterward. The ground team would learn to trust the crew's judgment, because they have no alternative. The relationship would evolve from collaboration to correspondence, and from correspondence to a kind of formalized mutual awareness that resembles diplomatic communication between distant nations, more than it resembles the intimate operational partnership that has defined human spaceflight for 60 years. On a Mars mission, that model collapses entirely. The crew cannot rely on Houston for real-time guidance. They cannot call home and wait for instructions. They cannot be talked through a procedure step by step while an engineer monitors their telemetry and watches for anomalies. The ground team becomes something closer to a correspondent than a partner. They can send advice, but it arrives minutes or tens of minutes after the moment it was needed. They can analyze data, but by the time their analysis reaches the crew, the situation on Mars may have already changed. NASA's own research acknowledges this bluntly. A technical paper published through the NASA Technical Reports Server on communication delays, disruptions, and blackouts for crewed Mars missions states that communication delays will have significant impacts on how the crew operates and interacts with mission control throughout their mission. The paper notes that the farthest humanity has ever been from Earth is just beyond the Moon, with missions experiencing few-second maximum communication delays and no significant periods of communication disruption. Any Mars mission, the paper continues, will be pushing these bounds significantly, with minutes of delays and disruptions lasting on the order of weeks. Weeks. Not minutes, weeks. Because the communication problem does not stop at delay. There is also the blackout. Approximately every 26 months, Earth and Mars find themselves on opposite sides of the Sun. This alignment is called solar conjunction. During conjunction, the Sun sits directly between the two planets, and its intense radiation disrupts or completely blocks radio communication. For a period of roughly 2 to 3 weeks, a crew on Mars would have no reliable contact with Earth at all. No voice calls, no data transmissions, no telemetry, no emergency signals. Nothing gets through. The crew is not just far from home, they are cut off from home in a way that has no precedent in human spaceflight history. During every previous crewed mission, from Mercury through Gemini, through Apollo, through the Space Shuttle, through the International Space Station, ground controllers have maintained continuous or near-continuous communication with the crew. Even astronauts aboard the ISS, orbiting just 250 miles above Earth's surface, are in constant contact with mission control. The psychological safety net of knowing that someone on Earth is listening, watching, and ready to help has been a foundational element of every human space mission ever flown. A Mars crew would not have that net. For weeks at a time, they would be completely alone. And even outside of conjunction blackouts, the minutes-long communication delays would make every interaction with Earth feel more like exchanging letters than having a conversation. This is the first fracture in the Apollo comparison. The Moon was close enough to keep Houston in the loop. Mars is not. The distance does not just make the mission longer, it makes the crew fundamentally more autonomous, more isolated, and more dependent on their own judgment than any human beings have ever been in the history of exploration. But the cultural narrative has not caught up to this reality. The public still imagines a Mars mission as a grander version of Apollo, a longer trip, a farther destination, but the same basic emotional architecture. Go, arrive, explore, come home. The astronauts are heroes. Earth watches in real time. The whole world holds its breath during landing. The crew plants a flag, says something historic, and begins the journey back. That image is deeply embedded in how we think about space exploration. It is reinforced by movies, by media coverage, by the language of space agencies themselves. Mars is described as the next giant leap, the next frontier, the next step. Each of these phrases implies continuity with the past. They suggest that Mars is simply farther down a road we have already been walking. But the road changes character completely once you cross a threshold of distance and time that no metaphor about frontiers can bridge. The moon was an expedition. You went, you came back. The trip took about a week. Mars is not an expedition in any sense that the word has previously meant. A crewed Mars mission using current or near-future technology would last approximately 2.5 to 3 years, about 9 months of transit to Mars. A surface stay of roughly 500 days, dictated by the need to wait for the next favourable planetary alignment for the return trip. Then another 9 months back to Earth, 2.5 years, minimum, and during that time the crew cannot come home early. There is no abort option after a certain point in the outbound trajectory. Once you commit to the Mars transfer, orbital mechanics locks you in. You are going to Mars. You will stay on Mars until the planets align again, and then, if everything works, you will begin the long journey home. If something goes wrong during the surface stay, during the months of waiting for the return window, there is no rescue mission, no emergency shuttle, no lifeboat. Earth is too far away, and the energy required to launch a rescue vehicle on an intercept trajectory is beyond anything that could be improvised on the timescale of a crisis. This is not how we think about exploration. Exploration, in the human imagination, always includes the possibility of turning back. Shackleton's crew was stranded in Antarctica, but rescue was conceivable. Apollo 13 had an abort mode. Even submarines at the bottom of the ocean can surface. Mars offers no equivalent. Once the crew lands, they are committed to a timeline dictated by celestial mechanics, not human choice. The planets do not care about emergencies, and yet, the cultural momentum continues to build. Mars is treated as a destination we are approaching with confidence. Mission architectures are published. Timelines are discussed. Astronaut selection criteria are debated. The conversation assumes that the hard part is the engineering, the rockets, the life support, the landing systems. Solve those problems and Mars becomes just another place humans go. What almost never enters the conversation is what it actually feels like to be that far from Earth for that long. What it means for a human being to watch the blue dot shrink in the rear window until it is just another star in the sky. What it means to speak a sentence to someone you love and then wait 44 minutes to hear their reply. What it means to know that if you get sick, if you break a bone, if you develop a tumour or a blood clot or an infection that the medical kit cannot handle, no hospital ship is coming. No evacuation is possible. No one can reach you. The seduction of Mars is the seduction of familiarity. It looks close because it looks like Earth. It feels achievable because we frame it using the language of Apollo. It seems inevitable because the cultural narrative has been building toward it for 70 years. But underneath that familiarity lies a distance that is not measured in miles alone. It is measured in minutes of silence, in weeks of blackout, in years of isolation, in the absolute certainty that once you leave, the version of Earth you knew will continue without you, and you will continue without it, separated by a gulf that no signal can cross in real time. The first humans to reach Mars will not simply be farther from home than anyone before them. They will be farther from home in a way that changes what home means. And that change, that quiet redefinition of the relationship between a human being and the world that made them, is what the familiar Mars narrative never mentions. What comes next reveals exactly how deep that separation goes, and why the wall of light minutes between Earth and Mars creates a kind of isolation that no previous explorer has ever faced. There is a moment in every long-distance phone call when the delay becomes noticeable. A half-second lag on a satellite connection, and and suddenly the rhythm of conversation breaks. You talk over each other, you pause awkwardly, you lose the natural flow of human exchange. That half-second delay is enough to make a phone call feel wrong. Now multiply it by 2,640. At its maximum distance from Earth, Mars sits roughly 22 light minutes away. A single sentence spoken by an astronaut on the Martian surface takes 22 minutes to reach mission control in Houston. The reply, assuming someone responds instantly, takes another 22 minutes to travel back. 44 minutes between saying something and hearing a response. That is not a conversation. That is correspondence. It is closer to writing a letter and waiting for the mail to arrive than it is to any form of human communication that our species has evolved to understand. And this is not the worst-case scenario. This is simply what happens when Earth and Mars are at their farthest orbital separation, a configuration that occurs with predictable regularity. Even at their closest approach, when the two planets are roughly 34 million miles apart, a one-way signal still takes over 3 minutes. A round trip takes more than 6. 6 minutes is long enough to sit through an entire emergency, make every critical decision, and either survive or die before anyone on Earth knows you are in trouble. The human brain is not designed for this kind of communication. Our species evolved in an environment where interaction was immediate. You spoke. The other person heard you. They responded. You adjusted. This feedback loop, measured in fractions of a second, is so fundamental to how we function that we rarely think about it. It governs collaboration, decision-making, emotional support, conflict resolution, and every other form of interpersonal exchange that holds human communities together. When the loop breaks, even slightly, the effects are immediate and measurable. Research on communication delay conducted for NASA over the past 2 decades has consistently found that increased latency produces frustration, miscommunication, reduced trust between teams, and degraded performance on collaborative tasks. A delay of just 5 seconds is enough to significantly impair the ability of 2 groups to work together on a complex problem. At 50 seconds, collaborative problem-solving becomes nearly dysfunctional. The delays experienced during a Mars mission would not be 50 seconds. They would be hundreds of seconds, sometimes exceeding 1,300 seconds. The collaborative relationship between a Mars crew and their ground support team would not be impaired. It would be functionally severed. This is not a theoretical concern. NASA has studied it extensively. A recent assessment published through the NASA Technical Reports Server examined 20 years of communication delay research and concluded that the operational paradigm used for every crewed mission since Project Mercury, a paradigm built on real-time ground support serving as the safety net for crewed spaceflight, will face fundamental challenges during missions beyond low Earth orbit. The assessment noted that Mars missions will encounter up to a 44-minute round-trip latency at maximum distance from Earth, and that previous research indicates increased isolation, and the challenges posed by delayed communication lead to heightened stress, frustration, adverse behavioral symptoms, and reduced individual performance. Consider that carefully. Heightened stress, frustration, adverse behavioral symptoms, reduced performance. And this is from controlled studies where participants knew they were safe, knew the experiment would end, and knew that the real world was just outside the laboratory door. Imagine those same psychological effects compounding over months and years inside a habitat on Mars, where the delay is not simulated, but absolute, where there is no door to walk through, where the isolation is not an experiment, but the permanent condition of your existence for the next 2.5 years. The communication delay does something that no previous spaceflight challenge has done. It removes Earth from the decision-making chain. On every crewed mission in history, ground controllers have been integrated into the real-time management of the spacecraft. When an alarm sounds on the International Space Station, flight controllers in Houston see the telemetry within seconds. They can assess the situation, identify the cause, and relay instructions to the crew while the event is still unfolding. The Apollo 13 crisis demonstrated this principle with life-or-death clarity. Every step of the improvised rescue depended on a signal delay so small it was imperceptible. The crew never had to wait for help. Help was already listening. A Mars crew would face emergencies of equal severity with none of that immediate support, carrying the full weight of every decision on their own shoulders across every minute of delay. On Mars, that collaboration is impossible. If an oxygen generation system fails, the crew must diagnose the problem, assess their options, and begin implementing a fix before their distress call even reaches Earth. By the time Houston receives the message, evaluates it, and sends a response, somewhere between 6 and 44 minutes will have passed. In an emergency where seconds matter, the crew is on its own. Completely. Without qualification. This changes the fundamental nature of the mission from a supported expedition to an autonomous operation. The crew does not have backup, they have correspondents. People who care about them, who are paying attention, who will send thoughtful and carefully considered advice. But that advice arrives on a time delay that makes it useless for anything requiring immediate action. The Mars crew must become their own mission control, their own flight surgeons, their own engineers, their own psychologists, their own decision makers in every crisis, large or small, that arises during a mission lasting years. No human crew in history has ever operated under these conditions. Even the most isolated expeditions on Earth, the overwinterers at Antarctic research stations, submarine crews on months-long deployments, sailors on long ocean voyages, all maintain some form of real-time or near-real-time communication with the outside world. Satellite phones, radio contact, emergency beacons that could summon rescue within hours or days. The Mars crew would have none of these. Their emergency beacon would take 22 minutes to reach anyone, and the nearest possible help would be roughly 9 months of spaceflight away. There is no rescue ship parked in orbit. There is no supply cache hidden over the next hill. There is only what they brought with them and what they can manufacture from Martian resources. The psychological implications of this autonomy are difficult to overstate. Humans are social animals who regulate their emotional states partly through connection with their communities. When that connection degrades, the effects are measurable and cumulative. Studies of Antarctic overwinter crews, who spend months in darkness and isolation with limited outside contact, consistently show increases in irritability, sleep disturbance, cognitive slowing, interpersonal tension, and what researchers call the third quarter phenomenon, a period of declining morale and motivation that typically occurs about 3/4 of the way through an isolated assignment. A Mars mission would last far longer than any Antarctic winter, and unlike Antarctic stations, which maintain daily communication with the outside world, a Mars crew would experience communication that is always delayed, sometimes disrupted, and periodically blacked out entirely. The third quarter phenomenon would not be a temporary dip in morale. It would be one phase in a sustained psychological endurance test lasting years, conducted under conditions of isolation more extreme than anything previously experienced by human beings. The blackout periods deserve particular attention because they represent something qualitatively different from mere delay. Communication delay is frustrating but manageable. You send a message, you wait, you get a response. The rhythm is slow, but it exists. Blackout eliminates even that rhythm. During solar conjunction, when the sun passes between Earth and Mars, radio signals are disrupted or completely blocked for a period of roughly 2 to 3 weeks. NASA's own analysis of conjunction communication disruptions confirms that all Mars missions will experience a single 2 to 3 week disruption at some point during their duration, and that for missions with long surface stays, this disruption will occur while the crew is on or near Mars. 2 to 3 weeks of total silence, no messages from family, no instructions from mission control, no news from Earth, no confirmation that anyone is listening. The crew would know intellectually that the blackout is temporary, that conjunction will pass, that communication will resume. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are very different things. The silence would be absolute, and it would arrive not at the beginning of the mission, when morale is high and the novelty of Mars is still sustaining the crew psychologically, but deep into the surface stay, when the monotony of daily operations has set in, and the reality of their isolation has become the background condition of their lives. Imagine the following scenario. A crew member develops symptoms that suggest a serious medical condition: an irregular heartbeat, persistent abdominal pain, neurological symptoms that could indicate a stroke or a brain bleed. The crew's medical officer examines the patient, runs what tests the limited onboard medical kit allows, and prepares a detailed report to send to the flight surgeons on Earth. But it is conjunction. The sun is blocking the signal. The message does not go through. The medical officer must make a diagnosis and a treatment decision without any input from the thousands of physicians, researchers, and specialists who have spent years preparing for exactly this kind of contingency. Whatever decision the crew makes, they make alone, and they live or die with the consequences alone. This scenario is not far-fetched. It is the predictable result of sending human beings to a place where communication with Earth is physically impossible for weeks at a time. NASA has studied medical contingencies for Mars missions and identified a long list of conditions that could arise during a multi-year mission. Conditions ranging from dental emergencies to cardiac events, to psychiatric crises, to trauma from equipment failures or habitat damage. For each of these contingencies, the current model of spaceflight medicine relies heavily on ground-based consultation. The flight surgeon on Earth reviews telemetry, consults specialists, and guides the crew through treatment protocols. On a Mars mission, that model breaks down. During conjunction, it disappears entirely. The communication wall also affects something less dramatic, but equally important: the daily texture of human connection. Astronauts on the International Space Station can call their families. They can video chat with their children. They can send and receive emails in near real time. They can watch live news broadcasts. They can participate, however imperfectly, in the ongoing life of their communities back home. These connections are not luxuries, they are psychological lifelines. Research on long-duration spaceflight consistently identifies family contact as one of the most important factors in maintaining crew morale and mental health. On Mars, family contact would be transformed into something barely recognizable. You could record a video message for your spouse and send it. 3 to 22 minutes later, they would receive it. They could record a reply and send it back. 3 to 22 minutes later, you would receive that reply. The exchange that takes 30 seconds in a phone call now takes up to 44 minutes. And the conversation is not really a conversation at all. It is a sequence of monologues, each one recorded and transmitted without any knowledge of how the other person reacted to the previous message. You cannot see your partner's face respond to your words in real time. You cannot hear your child laugh at your joke while you are telling it. You cannot share a moment of silence with someone you love. Every interaction is fractured by the delay into something that resembles communication but lacks its essential quality: presence. Over weeks and months, this degradation of connection would accumulate. The crew would not lose contact with Earth suddenly or dramatically. They would lose it gradually, in the same way that a friendship fades when two people stop being part of each other's daily lives. The people on Earth would continue their routines. Seasons would change. Holidays would come and go, neighbours would redecorate their houses, restaurants the crew once loved would close and be replaced. The news cycle would churn through crises and celebrations that the Mars crew would learn about minutes or hours after everyone else. The crew would become observers of Earth rather than participants in it. They would watch their own lives continue without them, transmitted in delayed fragments across millions of miles of empty space. This gradual disconnection is psychologically distinct from the acute stress of an emergency. It is slower, quieter, and in some ways more corrosive. Emergency stress is intense but focused. You have a problem, you solve it, or you do not. Disconnection stress is ambient. It seeps into everything. It colours every interaction with a faint sense of loss. It is the feeling of knowing that the world you belong to is continuing without you, and that by the time you return, the world and you will both be different in ways that neither side fully chose. The operational consequences of the communication wall extend beyond psychology into mission architecture itself. Every system on a Mars mission must be designed to function without real-time ground support. Every procedure must be written so that the crew can execute it independently. Every contingency plan must account for the possibility that no one on Earth will be able to offer guidance when the contingency actually occurs. This is an enormously different engineering philosophy from the one that has governed human spaceflight for 60 years. On the International Space Station, ground controllers routinely upload software patches, adjust orbital parameters, manage power systems, schedule crew activities, and monitor environmental systems in real time. This shared control model has been so successful that it has become the assumed baseline for human spaceflight. When something breaks, Houston knows about it immediately and begins working the problem alongside the crew. On Mars, the ground team would be reduced to an advisory role. They could study data that the crew sends down, analyze it overnight while the crew sleeps, and send recommendations that arrive hours later. For routine maintenance and non-urgent decisions, this model could work. But for anything time-sensitive, the crew would need to act first and inform Earth afterward. The reversal of the traditional relationship between crew and ground represents a fundamental shift in how human space missions operate. This shift also affects crew selection in ways that are rarely discussed publicly. The astronauts chosen for a Mars mission would need to be far more autonomous, resourceful, and psychologically resilient than any previous space crew. They would need to function not just as pilots and scientists, but as independent decision-makers capable of managing complex systems, resolving interpersonal conflicts, handling medical emergencies, and maintaining their own psychological stability for years, without the external support structures that every previous crew has relied on. Current astronaut selection already filters for exceptional candidates. But the Mars selection criteria would need to go further, identifying individuals who can tolerate prolonged isolation, who can maintain trust and cooperation within a small group under extreme stress, who can make high-stakes decisions without external validation, and who can cope emotionally with the slow erosion of their connection to everyone they have ever known. These are not just desirable qualities, they are survival requirements. A crew member who cannot function under these conditions does not just underperform, they become a risk to the entire mission. The wall of light minutes also creates an asymmetry between the crew and the public that would shape the mission's cultural meaning. During Apollo, the world watched the moon landing in near real time. The signal delay was barely over a second. When Armstrong stepped onto the surface, hundreds of millions of people heard his words within moments of his speaking them. The experience was shared. It felt immediate. It felt like humanity was there, together, witnessing something transcendent. A Mars landing would be different. The signal delay means that by the time Earth receives the crew's first words from the Martian surface, those words were spoken 3 to 22 minutes ago. The moment is already in the past before anyone on Earth knows it happened. The crew could be celebrating, or struggling, or dealing with a landing anomaly, and Earth would not know until the light speed signal finally arrives. The shared experience that made Apollo feel like a collective human achievement would be replaced by something more like reading a dispatch from a distant correspondent. Moving, perhaps. Historic, certainly. But not shared, not immediate, not ours in the way that Apollo was ours. This temporal separation subtly changes the relationship between the crew and the civilization that sent them. The Apollo astronauts were never really gone. They were always connected, always reachable, always part of the human world, even when they were standing on another celestial body. A Mars crew would cross a threshold where that connection degrades to the point that it no longer functions as a real bond. They would still be human. They would still care about Earth. Earth would still care about them. But the texture of that caring would be transformed by the delay into something that neither side has ever experienced. The wall of light minutes is not a technical problem to be solved. It is a physical law that cannot be circumvented. No amount of engineering can make signals travel faster than light. No relay satellite system can eliminate the delay, because the delay is not caused by signal routing, it is caused by distance. The signal travels at the fastest speed the universe allows, and it still takes minutes or tens of minutes to arrive. This is not a limitation of our technology. It is a limitation of reality. And this is what makes the Mars communication challenge fundamentally different from every previous obstacle in human spaceflight. Rockets can be made more powerful. Life support systems can be made more reliable. Radiation shielding can be improved. These are engineering problems with engineering solutions. The communication delay is not an engineering problem. It is a fact of physics. It exists at the same level of reality as gravity or the speed of light itself. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot innovate around it. You can only accept it and design your mission accordingly. Designing a mission accordingly means accepting that the crew will be alone in ways that no human being has ever been alone. Not alone, like a sailor in the middle of the Pacific, who can still radio for help and expect a response within seconds. Not alone, like an Antarctic researcher who can still call home every day. Alone, like no one in human history. Alone in a way that is defined not by the absence of other people nearby, but by the absence of real-time connection to anyone, anywhere. The crew would have each other, 4 to 6 people, depending on the mission architecture, sharing a habitat the size of a small apartment. For 2.5 years, they would be each other's entire social world. Every joke, every argument, every conversation, every meal, every moment of boredom and terror and tedium and wonder would be shared among the same small group of people with no possibility of bringing in a new voice, a fresh perspective, a different face. The psychological research on small group isolation suggests that interpersonal dynamics in confined environments become increasingly fraught over time. Irritations that would be trivial in normal life become magnified. Small habits become sources of conflict. Personality differences that were manageable in the short term become unbearable over months and years. On the International Space Station, crew rotations occur every 6 months. New people arrive, others leave. The social environment refreshes itself. On a Mars mission, there are no rotations, no new arrivals, no departures, the same faces for 1,000 days. And when the interpersonal tension becomes acute, there is no counselor to call, no manager to mediate, no option to take a walk outside and clear your head in any normal sense. The Mars surface offers a hostile vacuum where you can venture only in a pressure suit tethered to your oxygen supply for limited durations. Outside is not an escape. It is another confined space, just larger and more lethal. The wall of light minutes does not merely create a communication problem, it creates an existential condition. A Mars crew would live on the far side of a temporal barrier that separates them from the rest of humanity in a way that no geographic distance on Earth has ever done. They would exist in their own time, making their own decisions, managing their own crises, mourning their own losses, and celebrating their own victories with an audience that always hears about it minutes or hours later. This condition has no precedent. There is nothing in the history of human exploration that approximates it. Every analogy we reach for, polar expeditions, submarine deployments, isolated research stations, falls short because all of those situations maintain some form of real-time or near real-time connection to the broader human world. The Mars crew would not have that. They would have delayed correspondence and periodic blackouts, and the knowledge that no matter what happens to them, the response from Earth will always arrive too late to change the outcome. The wall is not made of stone or steel, it is made of time. 22 minutes of time, multiplied by the speed of light, stretched across the emptiness between 2 planets. And on the far side of that wall, the first humans on Mars would discover something that no amount of mission planning can fully prepare them for. The discovery that reaching Mars was not the hard part. The hard part is what happens to you after you arrive, when the distance becomes real, when the delay becomes permanent, and when you realize that the connection to Earth you carried in your heart is slowly, quietly, dissolving into static. What comes next reveals why even the architecture of return cannot undo what the journey itself does to the human beings who make it. Every Mars mission plan ever published includes a return trip. The crew launches from Earth, transits to Mars, lands, works on the surface, ascends back to orbit, and flies home. The architecture is drawn with arrows pointing both directions. There is an outbound leg and a return leg. On paper, the mission is round trip, but paper is patient. It will hold any plan you draw on it without asking whether that plan can survive contact with reality. The question that mission architects can diagram but cannot guarantee is whether the human beings who land on Mars will still be physically, operationally, and psychologically capable of completing that return leg after spending roughly 900 days exposed to conditions that no human body has ever endured for that long. The return arrow on the mission diagram is not a fact. It is a hope, and the distance between hope and certainty is measured in bone density, radiation dose, muscle mass, cardiovascular fitness, immune function, and the slow accumulation of damage that begins the moment the crew leaves Earth's protective embrace and does not stop until they return to it. If they return to it, start with what happens to the human skeleton in space. On Earth, your bones constantly remodel themselves. Old bone tissue is broken down by cells called osteoclasts. New bone tissue is built by cells called osteoblasts. This cycle keeps your skeleton strong because gravity provides continuous mechanical loading that signals your body to maintain bone density. Remove that gravitational signal and the cycle breaks. Bone resorption accelerates, bone formation slows. The result is a steady loss of bone mineral density that NASA has measured at approximately 1 to 1.5% per month during spaceflight. That rate has been documented on the International Space Station, where astronauts spend 6 to 12 months in microgravity. A Mars mission would expose the crew to roughly 9 months of microgravity on the outbound transit, then approximately 500 days on the Martian surface, where gravity is only 38% of Earth's, then another 9 months of microgravity on the return trip. The total time spent in reduced or absent gravity would be approximately 2.5 years. No human being has ever experienced that duration of gravitational deprivation. The longest continuous spaceflight in history was Valery Polyakov's 437 days aboard the Mir space station. A Mars mission would nearly double that record. At 1 to 1.5% bone loss per month, a crew member who spends 9 months in microgravity during outbound transit alone could lose between 9 and 13% of their bone mineral density before even reaching Mars. The Martian surface, at 38% Earth gravity, would slow but likely not stop the loss. Current research cannot confirm whether Mars gravity is sufficient to maintain bone homeostasis, because no human has ever lived in fractional gravity for an extended period. NASA's own risk assessments acknowledge that essentially nothing is known about how exposure to the fractional gravity environment on Mars might influence the time course of microgravity-induced bone loss. The crew would be living inside an experiment with their own skeletons as the test subjects. After 500 days on Mars and another 9 months of microgravity on the return trip, the cumulative bone loss could be severe, even with rigorous exercise countermeasures, which astronauts on the ISS perform for 2 hours daily. Post-flight bone recovery is incomplete. Studies of ISS crew members have shown that some astronauts do not fully recover their pre-flight bone density, even a year after returning to Earth. For a Mars crew, the duration of exposure would be far longer, the exercise equipment more limited by mass and volume constraints, and the recovery period non-existent until they land on Earth at the end of the mission. They would need to survive the physical stress of Earth re-entry and landing with bones that have been weakening for over 2 years. Now consider the muscles. In microgravity, muscles that normally work against gravity begin to atrophy. Without constant loading, muscle fibers shrink. Strength decreases. Even with the exercise protocols used on the ISS, astronauts experience measurable losses in muscle mass and functional capacity. NASA's fitness standards for Mars missions require maintaining at least 80% of baseline muscle strength. But whether that standard can be met over a mission lasting 2.5 years with limited exercise equipment remains unproven. The cardiovascular system faces its own degradation. In microgravity, the heart does not need to pump blood upward against gravity. It adapts by becoming smaller and less efficient. Blood volume decreases. The body's ability to regulate blood pressure upon standing, a reflex called orthostatic tolerance, deteriorates significantly. When astronauts return to Earth after 6 months on the ISS, many cannot stand without feeling faint. Some require assistance to walk. This deconditioning after 6 months is manageable because the astronaut can be supported by medical teams on Earth. After 2.5 years of reduced gravity, the deconditioning would be far more severe, and the crew would not be stepping out of a capsule onto a runway surrounded by physicians. They would be landing on Earth after a 9-month return transit in microgravity, potentially unable to stand under their own power, in a vehicle that may require them to perform physically demanding egress procedures. But the most insidious physiological threat is one that exercise cannot mitigate: radiation. Outside the protective cocoon of Earth's magnetosphere, the crew would be exposed to 2 sources of space radiation that are fundamentally different from anything experienced in low Earth orbit. The first is solar energetic particles, high-energy protons ejected during solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These events are unpredictable and can deliver dangerous radiation doses within minutes. The second is galactic cosmic rays, extremely high-energy particles originating from outside the solar system. These particles are so energetic that they penetrate spacecraft shielding, passing through the hull, through equipment, and through the bodies of the crew with minimal attenuation. Galactic cosmic rays are particularly concerning because current shielding technology offers only marginal protection. NASA's own documentation states that due to the highly penetrating nature of galactic cosmic rays, shielding is only marginally effective at reasonable thicknesses, and that increasing the thickness of the shielding adds substantial mass with minimal additional reduction in exposure. You cannot simply build a thicker wall. The particles go through it. Some types of shielding material actually make the problem worse by generating secondary radiation when cosmic ray particles strike atomic nuclei in the shield and produce showers of additional particles. The radiation exposure during a Mars mission would approach or exceed NASA's current permissible exposure limits. Those limits are designed to keep the risk of exposure-induced death from cancer below 3% at the 95% confidence interval. Analysis of radiation data collected by the Curiosity rover's radiation assessment detector during its transit to Mars in 2012 confirmed that a crewed Mars mission using current propulsion systems would expose the crew to radiation levels that raise their lifetime cancer risk by several percent. NASA has estimated that the existing radiation exposure limits would constrain long-duration missions to roughly 150 to 250 days in deep space. A Mars mission requires 400 to 600 days in the deep space environment, not counting surface time, during which the crew receives additional radiation exposure because Mars lacks a global magnetic field and its thin atmosphere provides only modest shielding. The biological effects of this exposure are cumulative, irreversible. Radiation damages DNA. It causes chromosomal aberrations in the cells that form the immune system. It has been linked to increased risk of cataracts, cardiovascular disease, and central nervous system effects, including potential cognitive decline. Animal studies suggest that exposure to space-relevant radiation doses can cause behavioral changes, impaired memory, and increased anxiety. These effects would compound over the course of a multi-year mission, gradually degrading the crew's health in ways that may not become fully apparent until months or years after the damage occurs. The immune system deserves particular attention because its degradation creates cascading vulnerabilities. Research on returning ISS astronauts has documented measurable immune suppression, including reduced T-cell function, reactivation of latent viruses, and altered cytokine profiles. These changes occur during 6-month missions where radiation exposure is partially mitigated by Earth's magnetosphere. During a Mars mission, the immune challenge would be far greater. The crew would face higher radiation doses, longer duration, and no possibility of medical evacuation if an immune-related condition becomes serious. The combination of these physiological stressors creates a compound risk that is greater than the sum of its parts. Bone loss increases fracture risk. Muscle atrophy reduces the ability to perform physical tasks. Cardiovascular deconditioning limits exercise capacity, which is itself the primary countermeasure against bone and muscle loss. Radiation degrades the immune system, making the crew more susceptible to infections that their weakened bodies would struggle to fight. Each system's deterioration accelerates the others. The body does not fail in one dramatic collapse. It erodes slowly across multiple systems simultaneously, and the erosion continues for the entire duration of the mission. Now layer the operational fragility on top of the physiological vulnerability. A Mars mission is not a single flight. It is a chain of distinct operations, each of which must succeed for the crew to return home. Launch from Earth, trans-Mars injection, 9 months of interplanetary cruise, Mars orbital insertion or direct entry, powered descent and landing on the Martian surface, surface operations for approximately 500 days, ascent from Mars to orbit, rendezvous and docking with the return vehicle if the architecture requires it, trans-Earth injection, 9 months of interplanetary cruise, Earth re-entry at speeds exceeding 25,000 miles per hour, landing. Each link in that chain carries risk. Each depends on hardware that must function after years of exposure to vacuum, radiation, thermal cycling, and micrometeorite bombardment. The ascent vehicle that lifts the crew off Mars must work perfectly after sitting on the Martian surface for 500 days in temperatures that swing between -100 degrees Celsius at night and marginally above freezing. During the warmest daytime conditions, the propulsion system must ignite on command after more than a year of dormancy. The guidance system must navigate precisely. The life support must sustain the crew through another 9 months of transit. Any single failure in this chain, if it cannot be repaired with the tools and parts the crew has on hand, ends the return trip. The Mars ascent vehicle deserves particular scrutiny because it is the single most critical piece of hardware in the entire mission, and the one that must perform perfectly after the longest period of dormancy. On Earth, rockets are maintained by armies of engineers right up until the moment of launch. Fuel systems are checked and rechecked. Valves are tested. Avionics are verified. The vehicle sits in a controlled environment, protected from weather, temperature extremes, and contamination. Even so, launch delays are common. Anomalies are found during final inspections. Parts are replaced hours before liftoff. The process of preparing a rocket for launch is meticulous, ongoing, and dependent on having access to an entire industrial infrastructure of spare parts, diagnostic equipment, and technical expertise. The Mars ascent vehicle would have none of this. It would be launched from Earth, travel for 9 months through interplanetary space, land on or be pre-positioned on the Martian surface, and then sit there for approximately 500 days before the crew needs it. During those 500 days, it would be exposed to conditions that are hostile to precision machinery in every conceivable way. Temperatures on the Martian surface swing between approximately -100 degrees Celsius at night and as warm as 20 degrees Celsius on a summer afternoon at equatorial latitudes, though landing sites at higher latitudes would see colder extremes. This thermal cycling, repeated every single Martian day for 500 days, places stress on seals, joints, wiring harnesses, and structural connections. Materials expand and contract. Microfractures can develop. Adhesives can degrade. Lubricants can migrate or evaporate in the near-vacuum atmospheric pressure. Martian dust would be another persistent threat. The dust on Mars is extraordinarily fine-grained, with particles as small as a few micrometers. It is electrostatically charged and clings to surfaces with tenacity. During dust storms, which can be regional or occasionally global in scale, this material coats everything exposed to the atmosphere. The ascent vehicle's exterior its thruster nozzles, its sensor ports, its docking mechanisms, all would accumulate dust over the course of the surface mission. Some of this dust contains perchlorates, chemically reactive compounds that could corrode certain materials over extended exposure. Even non-reactive dust accumulation in a thruster nozzle could affect engine performance if not thoroughly cleaned before launch. And cleaning a rocket engine on Mars would be a manual operation performed by crew members in pressure suits with limited tools. The propulsion system itself represents a profound engineering challenge. Most Mars ascent vehicle concepts rely on either hypergolic propellants, which ignite spontaneously on contact with each other and can be stored for long periods, or on propellant generated from Martian resources through in-situ resource utilization. Hypergolic fuels have the advantage of reliability but are highly toxic, creating storage and handling risks throughout the surface mission. In-situ propellant production, typically involving the generation of liquid oxygen and liquid methane from the Martian atmosphere and subsurface water ice, has the advantage of reducing the mass that must be launched from Earth, but introduces a dependency on a complex chemical processing system that must operate successfully on Mars for months before the crew even arrives. If the ascent vehicle uses in-situ propellant, the fuel production system must land on Mars and begin operating autonomously, years before the crew launches from Earth. It must extract carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere, harvest water ice from the subsurface, electrolyze the water into hydrogen and oxygen, and synthesize methane through chemical reactions, all while maintaining cryogenic storage tanks that keep the produced propellant in liquid form. This entire industrial process must operate in an environment where the average atmospheric pressure is less than 1% of Earth's, where temperatures plunge far below the freezing point of carbon dioxide, and where no human is present to fix anything that breaks. If the propellant production system fails and cannot be repaired remotely, the ascent vehicle will have no fuel when the crew arrives. The crew will land on Mars without the means to leave. Even assuming the propellant is successfully produced and stored, the moment of ascent from Mars is itself a high-risk operation with no margin for a second attempt. The crew boards the ascent vehicle after 500 days on the surface. They seal the hatch. They initiate the launch sequence. The engine must ignite on the first attempt. There is no launch control team standing by to scrub and recycle if an anomaly is detected in the final seconds of countdown. There is no pad crew to inspect the vehicle for ice buildup or debris. There is no range safety officer to abort the launch if the trajectory deviates. The crew presses the button and the engine either works or it does not. If it works, they must achieve Mars orbit, which requires precise guidance and sufficient propellant to reach the correct altitude and velocity. Mars has a thin atmosphere that provides negligible aerodynamic assistance during ascent, meaning the vehicle must rely almost entirely on its engines for the full climb to orbit. Once in orbit, depending on the mission architecture, the crew may need to rendezvous and dock with an Earth return vehicle that has been waiting in Mars orbit for the duration of the surface stay. That return vehicle has also been exposed to the space environment for over 2 years, experiencing thermal cycling, radiation bombardment, and micrometeorite impacts. Its propulsion system, life support, and guidance systems must all function correctly despite having been dormant for the entire surface mission. If the ascent engine does not ignite, or if it ignites but underperforms, or if the guidance system malfunctions, or if the rendezvous fails, the crew has no recourse. No second vehicle sits fueled and waiting on the Martian surface. No orbital asset can retrieve them. The architecture that was supposed to bring them home has failed, and the distance that separates them from Earth makes improvisation on any meaningful timescale impossible. The crew remains on Mars, and their survival becomes entirely dependent on the remaining consumables in the surface habitat, which were provisioned for a 500-day stay, not an indefinite one. They would have to ration supplies, hope that resupply missions could be launched from Earth at the next transfer window roughly 26 months later, and survive on Mars for an additional 2 years or more under conditions of extreme uncertainty and psychological strain. The daily reality of keeping a Mars habitat functional for 500 days is itself an exercise in relentless vigilance. Consider just the atmosphere inside the habitat. The crew breathes oxygen, exhales carbon dioxide, and releases moisture with every breath. The life support system must continuously scrub carbon dioxide from the air, replenish oxygen, manage humidity, filter particulates including any Martian dust tracked in from EVAs, monitor for trace contaminant gases, off-gassed by equipment and materials, and maintain atmospheric pressure within a narrow range that supports human physiology. Each of these functions is performed by specific hardware: pumps, fans, chemical beds, electrolyzer cells, sensors, valves, and controllers, all of which consume power, generate waste heat, and are subject to wear and eventual failure. On the International Space Station, the carbon dioxide removal system has experienced repeated malfunctions, requiring repair and workaround procedures. The oxygen generation system has had failures that temporarily required the crew to rely on backup chemical oxygen generators. The water recovery system, which processes urine and humidity condensate into potable water, has required extensive maintenance, including replacement of key components. Each of these repairs was possible because spare parts were available on station, stored in advance or delivered by cargo vehicles. On Mars, the spare parts inventory is fixed at mission start. Every component that might fail over 500 days must be anticipated, manufactured, tested, and launched from Earth years before the failure occurs. Anything not included in the inventory cannot be obtained. If a pump fails and no spare pump exists on Mars, the crew must find an alternative solution using whatever materials and tools they have, or accept the degradation of that system's function and its downstream consequences for their survival. The water system illustrates the fragility particularly well. A crew of 4 to 6 people requires a minimum of approximately 2 litres of drinking water per person per day, plus additional water for food preparation and hygiene. Over 500 days, even at minimal consumption, that exceeds 5,000 litres for a crew of 4. Launching that much water from Earth would be prohibitively expensive in terms of mass. Instead, the habitat would rely on a closed-loop water recycling system that recovers approximately 90% or more of all water used. That system must operate every day for 500 days without a failure severe enough to reduce its recovery rate below the threshold needed to sustain the crew. A 10% drop in recovery efficiency might sound minor, but over 500 days it compounds into a water deficit that could become life-threatening if not corrected. Every breath, every sip of water, every meal, every hour of warmth inside the habitat depends on machinery continuing to function in an environment that is actively hostile to machinery. The crew would spend a significant portion of their working hours on maintenance, monitoring system performance, replacing filters, calibrating sensors, repairing minor faults before they become major failures. They would become intimately familiar with every component of their life support system in a way that no ISS crew has ever needed to be, because on the ISS, if a repair exceeds the crew's capability, Houston can send a specialist procedure or a replacement part on the next cargo flight. On Mars, the crew is the last line of defense. If they cannot fix it, it stays broken. And if a critical system stays broken long enough, the habitat stops being habitable. There is no backup. On the ISS, a crew can evacuate to Earth in a Soyuz or Crew Dragon capsule within hours. On the Moon, Apollo demonstrated that an abort and emergency return could be executed in days. On Mars, the commitment made at departure becomes absolute upon landing. The next return window opens approximately 500 days into the surface stay. Every day before that window, no matter what breaks or who falls ill, the crew remains on Mars. The calendar is fixed by physics, and physics does not negotiate. If the ascent vehicle fails during month 3 of the surface stay, the crew cannot leave for another 23 months, assuming a replacement vehicle could even be sent, which would require launching it during the previous transfer window, approximately 2 years earlier, meaning it would have needed to be dispatched before the crew even left Earth. The logistics of Mars rescue are not difficult. They are effectively impossible on any timeline relevant to a crisis. This impossibility is what transforms a technically round-trip mission into a psychologically one-way experience. The crew knows, from the moment they land, that their survival depends entirely on the systems they brought with them and their ability to maintain those systems without resupply. Every meal they eat comes from a finite stockpile. Every breath they take is recycled by a life support system that must operate continuously for years. Every drop of water is reclaimed and purified by equipment that cannot be replaced if it fails. The margin for error is not small. It is essentially non-existent for critical systems. Consider the life support system alone. On the ISS, the environmental control and life support system is regularly serviced, upgraded, and resupplied. Components fail and are replaced. New hardware is launched on cargo vehicles every few months. If a critical system breaks down, a spare can be delivered from Earth within weeks. On Mars, there are no cargo deliveries. What the crew launches with is what they have. Every filter, every pump, every sensor, every valve must last the entire mission or be repairable, using the spare parts and tools available on site. The crew would need to be capable of diagnosing and fixing complex mechanical and electronic systems in an environment where a single failed component could mean the difference between breathable air and suffocation. The habitat itself adds another layer of vulnerability. A structure on the Martian surface must withstand dust storms, temperature extremes, ultraviolet radiation, and the constant low-level bombardment of cosmic rays. A breach in the habitat wall, caused by micrometeorite impact, structural fatigue, or equipment failure, would depressurize the living space. Mars has an atmospheric pressure less than 1% of Earth's. A pressurized habitat on Mars is essentially a balloon sitting in near vacuum. Any puncture is catastrophic unless it can be sealed immediately. The Martian environment offers no forgiveness. The average surface temperature is approximately minus 60 degrees Celsius. The atmosphere is 95% carbon dioxide, unbreathable by humans. Atmospheric pressure is so low that exposed liquid water boils away almost instantly. The same dust that threatens external hardware also threatens the crew directly. Perchlorates in Martian soil can disrupt thyroid function if inhaled or ingested over long periods, and every extravehicular activity brings trace amounts of surface material back into the habitat on suit joints, gloves, and boot treads. Over hundreds of EVAs across 500 days, this cumulative contamination of the crew's living space becomes a genuine health concern with no established countermeasure. The medical capability aboard a Mars mission would be the most limited in the history of human space. Exploration relative to the risks involved. NASA's Levels of Care framework for exploration missions acknowledges that Mars crews will need to manage a wide range of medical conditions autonomously, including low acuity chronic issues and high acuity life-threatening emergencies, some potentially requiring surgical intervention. The crew's medical officer would be a physician or a highly trained paramedic, but they would be working with equipment constrained by mass and volume limits, pharmaceutical supplies that degrade over time, and no ability to consult specialists in real time. Imagine a scenario where a crew member develops acute appendicitis during month 8 of the surface stay. On Earth, this is a routine surgical procedure performed hundreds of thousands of times per year. On Mars, it is a life-threatening emergency that must be managed with whatever surgical capability the habitat contains. If surgery is required, the medical officer must perform it in a confined space, potentially with limited anesthesia options, using instruments that may not include everything a surgeon would normally want, and with no possibility of transferring the patient to a hospital if complications arise. The nearest hospital is roughly 140 million miles away. Or consider a psychiatric emergency. The psychological stresses of a Mars mission, isolation, confinement, communication delay, monotony, interpersonal friction, sleep disruption, and the ever-present awareness of mortality create conditions ripe for psychological crisis. Depression, anxiety, psychotic episodes, or severe interpersonal conflict could emerge at any point during the mission. On the ISS, a crew member in psychological distress can be evaluated via real-time video with a flight psychologist and, in extreme cases, return to Earth within hours. On Mars, the crew member remains on Mars. The flight psychologist's advice arrives on a 22-minute delay. There is no evacuation. There is no psychiatric facility. There is only the habitat, the crew, and whatever coping mechanisms they can muster. These scenarios are not hypothetical worst cases. They are statistical likelihoods over a mission lasting 2.5 to 3 years. NASA's own human research program has identified 32 distinct space-related health risks that require study for prevention and mitigation. Among them are bone fracture, vision impairment, behavioral health crises, renal stone formation, cardiac dysrhythmia, and radiation-induced cancer. The probability that none of these conditions will manifest during a 3-year mission in an environment that actively promotes all of them is exceedingly low. Something will go wrong. The question is not whether but what and when, and whether the crew can handle it alone. This is the anatomy of a one-way experience. The mission plan says round trip. The architecture includes a return vehicle. The trajectory charts show an earthbound arrow, but the human bodies inside that plan are degrading. The systems they depend on are aging. The medical support available to them is minimal. The margin for error is vanishing. And every day that passes on the surface of Mars adds another layer of accumulated risk between the crew and the return leg of the mission. The return trip itself is not a rescue. It is another 9-month ordeal in microgravity, during which the crew's already compromised bodies will continue to deteriorate. More bone loss, more muscle atrophy, more radiation exposure, more cardiovascular deconditioning. By the time the crew reaches Earth, they will have spent approximately 18 months in microgravity total, plus 500 days in Martian gravity, which may not be sufficient to halt the decline. They will arrive at Earth in worse physical condition than any astronaut in history, and they will face the most physically demanding phase of the entire mission, re-entry and landing. Earth re-entry from an interplanetary trajectory is faster and more violent than re-entry from low Earth orbit. The vehicle would hit the atmosphere at approximately 25,000 miles per hour, generating extreme deceleration forces and temperatures. The crew must endure these forces with bodies that have been weakened by more than 2 years of reduced gravity, bones that have lost significant mineral density, muscles that have atrophied despite exercise, cardiovascular systems that struggle to maintain blood pressure under gravitational load. The landing itself, whether by parachute and airbag or propulsive descent, imposes additional mechanical stress on bodies that may not be able to withstand it safely. This is why the return arrow on the mission plan is a hope rather than a guarantee. Every system must work. Every crew member must remain healthy enough to operate the vehicle. Every contingency must be manageable with the resources on hand. And all of this must hold true not for a week or a month, but for roughly 1,000 days. 1,000 days of accumulated risk, accumulated damage, accumulated isolation, and accumulated psychological strain, all converging on a single critical phase where everything must go right for the crew to survive their arrival back on Earth. The engineers working on Mars mission architectures are not naive about these risks. They are among the most talented and dedicated professionals in the world, and they are working earnestly to mitigate every threat they can identify. Better exercise equipment, improved radiation shielding materials, autonomous medical diagnostic systems, redundant life support components, psychological support protocols. Each mitigation reduces the risk by some increment, but none eliminates it. And the irreducible residual risk, the risk that remains after every countermeasure has been applied, is higher for a Mars mission than for any crewed spaceflight ever attempted. This residual risk is what transforms the mission from a round trip into something that exists in an ambiguous space between going and never fully coming back. Even if the crew returns to Earth alive, they return as different people. Their bodies have been altered by years of radiation and reduced gravity in ways that may not be fully reversible. Their minds have been shaped by years of isolation and autonomy that have no parallel in human experience. Their relationships with the people they left behind have been stretched across millions of miles and thousands of silent minutes, until the connections may no longer resemble what they were before departure. The mission can include a return vehicle. It can include a return trajectory. It can include every contingency plan and engineering safeguard that human ingenuity can devise. And it can still become, in practice, a one-way journey. Not because the crew cannot physically return, but because of the accumulation of physical damage, operational fragility, and psychological transformation over the course of the mission changes what return means. The people who come back, if they come back, are not the same people who left. The Earth they return to is not the same Earth they departed, and the gulf between who they were and who they have become may be as vast as the gulf between the two planets. What comes next explores the deepest consequence of this separation, the realization that the first humans on Mars may not simply be explorers who went far, but people who crossed a threshold that permanently altered their relationship with everything they once called home. There is a photograph taken by the Voyager 1 spacecraft on February 14, 1990, from a distance of approximately 3.7 billion miles. In that photograph, Earth appears as a pale blue dot, less than a single pixel wide, suspended in a beam of scattered sunlight. Carl Sagan requested that photograph. He wanted humanity to see itself from far away. He wanted us to understand what we look like from the outside. The image is haunting not because it shows Earth as small, but because it shows Earth as dismissible, a fleck of light that could be mistaken for a camera artifact, a smudge that means nothing unless you know what it is. From 3.7 billion miles, everything you have ever loved, every person you have ever known, every story ever written, every song ever sung, every war ever fought, every child ever born exists on that barely visible point of light. The first humans on Mars would not be 3.7 billion miles away. They would be much closer, roughly between 34 million and 250 million miles depending on orbital position. But closeness is relative. From the surface of Mars, Earth would appear as a bright point of light in the pre-dawn or post-sunset sky. Not a world, not a blue marble, a dot. Brighter than most stars, dimmer than Venus appears from Earth. You could cover it completely with the tip of your smallest finger held at arm's length. Everything you left behind, everyone you love, the entire human civilization that built the rocket that brought you here, fits behind your fingernail. Astronauts who have orbited Earth describe a phenomenon called the overview effect. Seeing the planet from space, they report a cognitive shift, a sudden understanding of Earth's fragility and beauty, and the interconnectedness of all life on its surface. The overview effect is powerful because the astronaut can still see Earth as a world. Continents are visible, oceans are blue, city lights glimmer on the night side. The planet is close enough to feel present, alive, real. It is still clearly home. From Mars there would be no overview effect. There would be something else entirely. Something no astronaut has ever experienced and no psychologist has a name for. The sight of Earth as a point of light, too small to show any detail. No continents, no oceans, no evidence of life. Just a dot in a dark sky, indistinguishable from any other star except by its position and brightness. The visual connection to home, the ability to look up and see your world and recognize it, would be gone. Home would not look like home anymore. It would look like a coordinate, a direction, an abstraction. This visual severing may seem like a small thing compared to the physiological and operational challenges already described. It is not. Human beings orient themselves emotionally through sensory connection to their environment. The sight of familiar landscapes, the sound of familiar voices, the physical presence of familiar people, these are not luxuries, they are the foundations of psychological stability. When all of them are removed simultaneously and replaced with an alien landscape, an alien sky, and the knowledge that everyone you care about is reduced to a point of light you can blot out with your thumb, something fundamental changes in how you experience your own existence. The crew would still be human. They would still think in human ways, feel human emotions, carry human memories. But they would be human in a context that no human has ever inhabited. They would be the first people in the history of the species to live beyond the sensory reach of Earth, not just far from Earth, beyond it, unable to see it as anything more than a star, unable to hear a voice from its surface without enduring minutes of silence, unable to touch anything that came from it except the supplies they carried and each other. This is the threshold that separates a Mars mission from every previous act of exploration. It is not a threshold of distance, though the distance is immense. It is a threshold of connection. Every explorer in history, no matter how far they travelled, maintained some form of sensory link to the world they came from. Magellan's crew saw familiar stars. Polar explorers walked on the same planet. Even Apollo astronauts could look out their window and see the whole Earth, luminous and unmistakable, never more than 250,000 miles away, and always reachable within 3 days. The first humans on Mars would cross beyond all of that. They would enter a condition of sensory disconnection from Earth that has no precedent, no analogy, and no established psychological framework for understanding what it does to a human mind over months and years. The temporal disconnection compounds the sensory one. On Earth, human beings live inside a shared present. When something happens, news of it spreads across the globe within seconds. You can call someone on the other side of the planet and hear their voice in real time. The entire human species, for all its divisions, inhabits a common temporal experience. Events happen and are known about more or less simultaneously by everyone who is paying attention. This shared present is so fundamental to how civilization functions that we rarely notice it. It is the invisible medium through which culture, politics, commerce, relationships, and daily life all flow. A Mars crew would be excluded from that shared present. Their present would be offset from Earth's by 3 to 22 minutes. They cannot participate in a live broadcast. They cannot join a video call. They cannot watch a sporting event, follow breaking news, or share a meal over a screen with a family member in anything resembling real time. They would exist in a parallel timeline, close enough to know what Earth is doing but too far away to do it with them. Over time, this temporal exile would produce a subtle but profound psychological effect. The crew would begin to feel like observers of Earth rather than participants in it. They would receive updates the way a historian reads dispatches from the past, informed but uninvolved. The emotional content of those updates would diminish not because the crew stops caring, but because the delay strips the communication of its immediacy. A birthday greeting that arrives 14 minutes after the birthday moment has passed. An expression of worry that reaches the crew 20 minutes after the crisis that prompted it has already been resolved or worsened. A declaration of love that hangs in the void for 11 minutes before the recipient even knows it was spoken. Each of these small disconnections is individually survivable. People endure worse separations every day. But the Mars crew would experience all of them simultaneously, continuously, for years. The cumulative effect is not a single dramatic rupture, but a slow dissolution. The bonds that connect them to Earth do not snap. They stretch, they thin, they become translucent, and at some point, perhaps impossible to identify precisely, those bonds stop functioning as bonds and become something more like memories of bonds. Echoes of a connection that used to be alive but has faded into something formal and distant. This is not speculation, it is a pattern observed in far less extreme forms of separation. Military families, long-distance relationships, expatriate communities all report that sustained separation, even with modern communication, gradually changes the quality of emotional connection. People adapt to absence. They build new routines that do not include the absent person. They form new relationships, develop new habits, create a daily life shaped by who is present rather than who is missing. The absent person becomes a beloved idea rather than a lived reality. This adaptation is healthy and necessary, but it means that by the time the Mars crew returns to Earth, if they return, the people they left behind will have adapted to their absence, and the crew will have adapted to a life without them. The reunion, if it happens, would not be the triumphant homecoming of the Apollo astronauts, who were separated from their families for 8 days. It would be a meeting between people who have spent nearly 3 years living in fundamentally different realities. The crew would return to an Earth that has changed in ways they did not witness. Children would have grown. Friends would have moved. Technologies would have shifted. Cultural conversations would have evolved. The crew would be strangers in their own world, disoriented not by jet lag but by a temporal and experiential gap that no amount of briefing can bridge. They would carry memories of sunrises on Mars, of storms that turned the sky amber, of the sound of their own breathing inside a helmet on a world where no one else has ever breathed. Those experiences would be unintelligible to anyone who was not there. And the experiences that everyone on Earth shared during their absence, the elections, the crises, the cultural shifts, the personal milestones, would be equally unintelligible to them. This mutual unintelligibility is what makes the separation functionally permanent, even if the crew physically returns. You can bring a person back to a place. You cannot bring them back to a time. The Earth the crew departed no longer exists. The people they were when they left no longer exist. The relationships they maintained through delayed messages across millions of miles are not the same relationships they would have maintained through daily presence. Everyone involved has become someone slightly different, shaped by experiences the other side can never fully share. The crew does not return to their old lives. They arrive at new lives that happen to be located where their old lives used to be. This is the deepest meaning of the title of this story. The first humans on Mars would never see Earth again, not because they would die on Mars, though that is possible, and not because no return vehicle would be provided, though that return is uncertain, but because the Earth they knew, the Earth they left, the Earth that existed in their memories and their hearts during every minute of every day they spent 140 million miles away, would be gone by the time they got back. The Earth they would return to is a different Earth. The people on it are different people, and the crew themselves are different people. The reunion is real. The return is real. But the homecoming, in the deepest human sense of that word, is an illusion. You cannot come home to a moment. You can only come home to a place. And the place is not the same. There is a particular cruelty in this that distinguishes it from ordinary human separation. When a soldier deploys overseas, they miss months of their child's life. But they share the same planet. They breathe the same air. They watch the same moon rise. They can call home and hear a voice without delay. They know, with certainty, that if something truly terrible happens, they can be brought home. The separation is painful, but it is bounded. It has edges. It has an end date. It exists within a framework of normal human experience. A Mars crew would have none of those anchors. Their separation would be unbounded in the sense that no emergency recall is possible. It would be open-ended in the sense that the return depends on orbital mechanics and system survival, not human decision. It would be sensory in the sense that they cannot see, hear, or feel Earth in any meaningful way. And it would be temporal in the sense that their experience of time itself diverges from Earth's experience of time through the communication delay. They would be, in every dimension of human connection, further from home than any person has ever been. And the further they get from home in those dimensions, the more the word home itself changes meaning. For the crew, Mars would gradually become the primary reality, not Earth. Not the place they came from, but the place they are, the habitat they live in, the landscape they walk across, the people they share meals with, the routines they follow, the problems they solve. Human beings are remarkably adaptive. Given enough time, we normalize almost any environment. The crew would normalize Mars. They would develop routines and rhythms suited to Martian days. They would learn the patterns of Martian weather. They would find satisfaction in the work of survival and exploration. They would create a microculture, a tiny civilization of 4 to 6 people with its own jokes, its own shorthand, its own unspoken rules. And as that Martian life solidified, the Earth life they left behind would soften, not disappear, but recede. Become something they think about less urgently as the months turn into years. This psychological adaptation is not a failure. It is a survival mechanism. The crew cannot afford to spend their days grieving for Earth. They have work to do, systems to maintain, science to conduct, each other to support. The mission demands their full attention, and giving it requires that they invest emotionally in where they are rather than where they were. But that investment comes at a cost. Every unit of emotional energy directed toward Mars life is a unit withdrawn from Earth life. The crew does not decide to let go of Earth. They simply run out of capacity to hold on to it while also functioning on Mars. This is why even a mission with a return architecture can become psychologically one way. The crew adapts. The delay enforces distance. The isolation normalizes. The bonds thin. By the time the launch window for return arrives, approximately 500 days into the surface stay, the crew may be more emotionally attached to the world they are on than the world they came from. Not because Mars is better than Earth, but because Mars is present and Earth is abstract. You live where you live, you bond with the people you see, you find meaning in the work you do. And after 500 days, all of that is on Mars. The people on Earth would undergo a parallel process. In the first weeks after launch, the Mars crew would dominate the news. Every update would be front-page material. Every delayed video message would be broadcast to millions. The crew would be celebrities, heroes, the most famous human beings alive. But fame is a function of attention, and attention is a function of novelty. As weeks become months and months become years, the daily updates from Mars would gradually recede in public consciousness. Other stories would take priority. Other crises would demand attention. The crew would shift from headline news to a background fact of life, like the ISS, which orbits Earth right now, carrying astronauts whose names most people could not identify. The crew's families would maintain their focus longer than the public, but even family attention is shaped by the constraints of daily life. Children go to school, partners go to work. Birthdays are celebrated with the people who are present, not the people who are a delayed video message away. The family does not forget the crew member on Mars, but they build a life that functions without them. They have to. The alternative is to spend 3 years in suspended animation waiting for someone to come back, and that is not how human beings work. People live forward, not in stasis. When the crew returns, they return to families and a public that have moved on. Not cruelly, not deliberately, just naturally. The way rivers flow around obstacles, the way life fills the space that absence creates. The crew would find that the world continued without them, and continued effectively. Their absence was felt, mourned, adapted to, and eventually incorporated into the normal fabric of daily life. Their return would be celebrated, but the celebration would have an undercurrent of strangeness. The crew would be honoured for what they did, but the people honouring them would be strangers in subtle ways, familiar faces with unfamiliar stories, shared histories that no longer quite align. This is the isolation that no engineering solution can fix. It is not a problem of rockets or life support or radiation shielding. It is a problem of time and distance, and the way human bonds work when stretched beyond their natural limits. The first humans on Mars would be the first humans to experience a separation from their species, so complete that the ordinary mechanisms of connection, the daily interactions that maintain relationships and sustain communities and keep human beings feeling like they belong to something larger than themselves, would cease to function. The crew would not be abandoned. They would be remembered, supported, admired, and loved from afar. But from afar is the operative phrase, and on Mars, Afar means something it has never meant before. The historical significance of this moment is rarely framed correctly. The first footsteps on Mars are usually described as the next great achievement in human exploration, a triumph of engineering and courage, a milestone in our expansion into the solar system, and they would be all of those things. But they would also be something else, something darker and more complicated. They would be the first moment in human history when members of our species voluntarily crossed a threshold of separation that may not be fully reversible, not because they cannot physically return, but because the act of going, of spending years on the far side of that wall of light minutes, changes them and changes their relationship to Earth in ways that no return trip can undo. Every previous frontier in human history has been eventually integrated into the fabric of ordinary life. The Americas were distant until they were not. Australia was isolated until it was not. Even Antarctica, the most remote continent, is serviced by regular flights and maintains real-time communication with the rest of the world. These frontiers were absorbed into the human sphere. Mars will not be absorbed. Not in the first generation. Not with the first crew. The distance is too great. The communication delay is too long. The travel time is too vast. Mars will remain outside the human sphere for decades, perhaps centuries, after the first landing. The crew who goes there will not be pioneers settling a new territory within the human world. They will be emissaries crossing out of the human world into something that does not yet have a name. The terror of a crewed Mars mission is not the risk of death, though that risk is real and substantial. Astronauts accept the risk of death when they join the program. They understand that spaceflight is dangerous. They make peace with that danger through training, preparation, and a belief in the mission's importance. The terror that is never spoken about, the terror that lurks beneath the triumphant narrative of Mars exploration, is the risk of something worse than dying. It is the risk of living on Mars long enough that Earth stops being home. It is the risk of coming back and discovering that you no longer fit into the world you came from. It is the risk of standing on a planet 200 million miles away and realizing that the people you love are becoming memories, that the life you plan to return to is dissolving in the time lag between your messages, and that you are slowly, imperceptibly, becoming someone who belongs to Mars more than to Earth. That is what it means to never see Earth again. Not the literal inability to return, though that possibility haunts every mission architecture, but the deeper, more personal, more human inability to return to the life you left. The Earth you see through your telescope on a Martian evening is not your Earth. It is a dot of light carrying the faintest echo of a world you used to inhabit. The voices you hear in your headset, arriving 11 or 14 or 22 minutes after they were spoken, are not the voices of people you are talking to. They are the voices of people who are talking to you in a past that has already ended by the time you hear it. The love you feel for the people back home is real, but it is a love sustained by memory rather than presence, by imagination rather than experience, by the knowledge of what was rather than the reality of what is. The first humans on Mars would carry Earth inside them, in their DNA, in their memories, in the language they speak and the food they crave, and the songs they hum during long Martian nights. They would never fully leave Earth behind in the sense of forgetting it or ceasing to care about it. But they would leave it behind in the sense that matters most. They would leave behind the experience of living on Earth, the experience of being embedded in its daily life, the experience of being present with the people they love in real time, without delay, without interruption, without the vast indifferent silence of interplanetary space stretching between every word. And when they look up at the Martian sky and find the pale blue dot that is Earth barely visible among the stars, they would understand something that no human being has ever understood before. That home is not a place you can always return to. That distance is not just a measure of miles, but a measure of everything that connects you to the people and the world that made you who you are. And that the first step on Mars, the step that will be celebrated as humanity's greatest achievement, is also the step that carries a human being further from home than anyone has ever gone, not just in space. In every dimension of human experience that gives the word home its meaning, the first humans on Mars would be explorers, scientists, engineers, and pioneers. They would also be the first people in history to discover what it truly costs to leave Earth, not in dollars or fuel or engineering challenges, but in the quiet, accumulating, irreversible currency of human connection. The distance would not kill them. It would simply change them into people for whom Earth is no longer the place they live, but the place they remember. And that change, that subtle and permanent rewriting of a human being's relationship with their own world, is the price of Mars. It is a price that no mission plan accounts for, no budget includes it, no timeline schedules it, but it is the most real cost of the journey, and it is paid not in the moment of departure, not in the drama of landing, but slowly, silently. Across every one of the 1,000 days that separate the first footstep on Martian soil from the last glimpse of a pale blue dot fading in an alien sky, that is the truth buried beneath every artist's rendering of astronauts. Planting flags in red soil, beneath every inspirational speech about humanity's next giant leap, beneath every mission patch and countdown clock and documentary trailer that frames Mars as a destination. It is not a destination, it is a departure. The first human beings to stand on Mars will look down at their boots pressing into alien ground and feel the weight of an achievement that took 70 years of dreaming and engineering to realize. And in that same moment, whether they know it yet or not, they will already be standing on the far side of a line that no one before them has ever crossed. The line where leaving becomes its own kind of arrival, and arrival becomes its own kind of loss.